3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1.
Welcome in to the Husker Extra podcast. I'm Chris. There's Sipple. There's Parker. We had a false start a minute ago because someone just ripped off a curse word when we originally started the story. We're not going to talk about
take a guess on who that would be.
We're not going to talk about who it was. But you can probably tell who's already getting a little defensive about it. So we'll just leave it at that. And that's fine. You know what? These things happen. These things happen when you record these things. It's 12:40 p.m. on Thursday, April 29th, 2021, in the year of our Lord. It's a beautiful Thursday afternoon. The sun is shining. The breeze is rustling the leaves. The birds are singing. Spring game is a couple days away, Saturday afternoon, 1 p.m., Memorial Stadium. Us and about 40,000 of our closest friends in the stadium to check it out. We'll have a lot of football talk today. We'll touch on the baseball team too. Big weekend series against Rutgers. So let's get right into it. We heard from Scott Frost yesterday, and he talked about the format for the spring game. They're basically they're what they call thud in the first half, which means no tackling. You get touched and you're down essentially, and then they'll let the younger guys kind of go full contact second half, and that's because in part because Nebraska had a pretty physical spring practice. I believe Coach Frost said the number was 43 guys at one point or another were on the injured list with various maladies. And so they're going to take it a little easy Saturday, and I'll kind of turn it over to you guys. What are your thoughts on that format, and what do you think that allows us to maybe see or not see on Saturday?
Format makes sense in that I think if you turned it around, instead we're going to have the young guys play live for the first half, and then the veterans thud up in the second, you might get some people filing for the exits. This way it keeps, I think it's sort of like the prelims or the first half or kind of the undercard. Even though it's the first unit guys, they're going to be thudding up. Now, when they go live after halftime, I think that'll be really interesting to watch, and there'll be a lot of young guys that people are interested in playing in that. And I think it'll keep people engaged.
It sounded when Frost was talking about it yesterday, like he said that they went around and around on the format, and I think that this was almost like not a compromise necessarily, but this was a way to get some of the veterans on the field at all. I mean, when he in a couple of the follow-ups, he didn't say explicitly that most of the veterans just weren't going to play in however they had it set up before the final format they landed on, but he did say, I think they're going to play. Some of the veterans are going to play. Adrian will play in the first half now that we're going thud in the first half rather than going live. So I think this was like if you're Adrian Martinez or if you're Cam Taylor Britt, you might. I mean, to me, I think those guys are probably champing at the bit to get out there and play a little bit with 35 or 40,000 people in the stands.
Yeah.
It's been so long. Like in a normal year, I don't know if those guys would even play in a spring game like this on Saturday. But this almost feels like a compromise to let some of those guys get out, run around, throw the ball around a little bit, catch a couple passes or whatever, just because of all of the circumstances involved. So, it's going to be, it's not going to be live in the first half, but I do think there's a bunch of guys who will be very interesting to watch after halftime.
Yeah, it's
go ahead, Bass.
No, I was basically just going to agree with Parker. I think compromise is the right word, in that if you're gonna have 30,000, 40,000, whatever the final number ends up being in the stands, then you got to give him a carrot, right? Like you got to let Adrian go out there and throw it around a little bit, and you got to let Samari Toure and Omar Manning run some routes and catch some deep balls and whatnot. You got to give him a little something for letting them in. So I get that. And like Parker said, if you're going to go full contact, those guys probably aren't playing. And especially, like the running back situation too, if they're full contact, none of those guys are probably getting on the field. So I tend to agree. I think this is a good compromise. It's a way for what you hope is that Adrian goes out there and looks really good in the thud portion of it, and isn't, airmailing throws and things like that. So,
you know what I was thinking about when you were talking. think about the second half in the context of the young running backs. Now, we're going to see a lot of meaningful action just in that regard because we haven't seen Sevion Morrison, we haven't seen Gabe Irvin. Sevion Morrison's a redshirt freshman or a second-year freshman. Gabe Irvin just arrived in January. We haven't seen like that walk-on was it Jaquez Yant?
Jaquez Jant.
Yeah.
Jaquez Jant. The Yant man.
We haven't seen – we haven't seen a lot of these guys much at all. Yeah. And we're kind of seeing them running against the defense. Which I think
you're seeing them play in front of 30,000 too, in front of 40,000.
Right.
None of those guys have done that. So that's part of it too.
Yeah. So that's now there's some guys that aren't going to play that I wish we are going to see, like, we might as well address it now. Like JoJo Doman won't play. Ben Stilley won't play. Will Honus looks like he's hurt his knee. He's not going to play. Javin Wright's not going to play. He's just dinged up. So there's some guys that people would want to see that aren't. Parker, who else are we talking about?
Yeah, offensively, obviously probably the biggest single piece of news this week, and we'll see with Will Honus. We'll get more information on that from Scott Frost at some point about how serious that is. But Thomas Fidoni's out now with a knee injury. It's Thursday today. He's having surgery today. Out probably at least until midseason. And then on offense, we know that Marquise Stepp and Ramir Johnson, the running backs, are out or have missed the whole spring. Alante Brown and Marquise Stepp are expected to be back at some point this summer. But so offensively, guys, you won't see Stepp and Ramir Johnson, Thomas Fidoni, obviously, and Alante Brown is sort of the starting point for guys that'll be out. And it's Thursday, like Baz said, 12:47 p.m. We haven't seen spring game rosters yet, but that's the picture, the injury picture that we're aware of at this point. And then we'll see, how exactly they split guys up and how many guys are out when those rosters come out, either later today or tomorrow.
Let's see what else. Well, one of the I'd say developments of spring has been the receiver core. Looks pretty good. Now there's some people that have told me since don't go overboard with that discussion. But they look pretty good to me. It's different. They look much different in that they're actually over 6 foot. They have Samari Toure starting in the slot at 6'3". Xavier Betts looks like he's had a pretty good spring, 6'2" or 6'3". Everybody says 6'2". He looks taller than that to me. Omar Manning's 6'4". He's been practicing. How tall is that Oliver Martin? Is he 6'2"?
6'1".
6'1". I think it's a pretty good group. Frost has said he likes that receiver group in terms of depth and talent more than he's liked anyone since he's been here. I can see why. But they got to go prove themselves. That's probably the big thing.
With Toure, with Samari Toure, I'm guessing probably only getting some run in the first half and Alante Brown out. If you were looking for a spring game MVP candidate, I would think that Will Nixon's a guy who's going to get a ton of run. Maybe with the top group, some in the first half, but I would think he'd play a lot in the second half, just given the position he plays and all that. So,
hey, Baz. And Parker, This is Paz. Paz has been around here a long time. How it always there's some kind of guy that emerges in the spring game, that big star that's not a big name. I'll give you one, Parker, right at that position, Baron Miles Jr.
Yeah. Yep.
How about Baron Miles getting about 11 catches for 170?
Yep.
Jeez.
11 for 170. Mark it down right now. I'm going to tweet it. Here's
I'm going to take the under on both of those. We joke, but I know.
Over.
But
pump it up. Over.
We joke, but like this is going to be set up for those guys to succeed, right? Like they're not going to go out there and expect Cam Taylor Britt to lock somebody down for a half. Like it's going to be
Bunch of zero blitzes.
Bunch of zero blitzes. It's basically going to look like a shell drill, 7-on-7 a lot of times, especially with the thud part of it. Like Adrian's going to have all day to throw. Those guys are going to have all day to run. So they're not going to go out there with the intent of making that offense look bad and making that receiver group look bad, especially with the way their coaches talked about them all spring.
The second half is going to be super interesting, though. I mean, we talked about the young running backs and receiver group and all that, but it's extended full speed action for the two young quarterbacks too, with Smothers and Harburg. I mean, I think that's what a lot of people will have their eye on is Frost. Frost talked yesterday. Frost has been really complimentary of Logan Smothers the whole way, and in the pockets where we've seen him, there's times where he looks fine, and there's times where the ball just doesn't come out of his hand with a whole lot of, smoke, as they call it, or it wobbles or whatever. And so he's a young guy. Frost has talked about the sort of extensive mechanical work that he's been doing with Mario Verduzco basically since he got to campus a little over a year ago, obviously largely interrupted last spring and summer because of the pandemic. But the thing that is interesting is Frost said, when he doesn't think about it, it's what it looks like, right? I mean, I'm not an expert, but when you watch Smothers in that open practice, there was times where it looked like he was thinking about his feet or he was trying to be very mechanically sound. And it just, you kind of get bogged down in that. But there were other times where he got in kind of a good rhythm. So one of the things I'm interested in, and it doesn't have that much bearing on whether he ends up being the number 2 this fall or not, but I'm just sort of interested to see what it looks like if he gets in a good rhythm, leads a long drive in the second half, or same with Harburg, can you make a big play? Can you play fast? All that sort of stuff. That's the challenge for those guys. And it's going to be interesting to just sort of see what that looks like over a little bit more of like a game flow situation than we've seen so far with either of those guys.
Breakout star Matt Masker, 23 for 27 for 372 yards and 6 touchdowns.
Yeah,
we're just throwing out ridiculous numbers for people.
Half of it to Baron Miles Jr.
Half of it to Baron Miles Jr.
Yeah, we're talking about Matt Masker like he's Phillip Rivers on Sunday.
Oh, it's going to be amazing.
Now, I'll tell you, kind of a hidden part of the last spring game we saw, and I talked to you guys about this the other day, that I thought it was fascinating, and I didn't know what to think of it, but it's interesting. It's interesting in retrospect. In 2019, I was really jacked up. Well, everybody was, to see what Adrian looked like. And he didn't look that good in that spring game. I mean, I would say if you went back, I bet the stats weren't very good. And if you watched it, you'd say, wow, yeah, he just didn't, he was coming off a huge 18 season. You thought, well, this is going to look interesting. And it really didn't look good. It didn't look particularly good at all. And all by way of saying you can take things out of this thing about individual players for sure. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder how much you can take out of it in a team sense, because they're playing each other. But I think with individuals, you can take good and bad out of it.
Well, and a lot of the stuff you take out of it, you don't realize until the season starts, right? Like you mentioned Adrian a few years ago. Like, he didn't look good. And then the season started and he still didn't look good. So you go, oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. So I totally get what you're saying, and I agree with you. And I think you're right that we'll probably see some stuff that we can take out of this, but we won't have a lot of real, concrete.
Context.
Yeah, we won't have a lot of context until, they're playing Illinois at the end of August.
Right. That's right.
So who knows? I mean, but yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right, Sip. I think we'll see some stuff, whether we know it or not, Saturday, that when next fall rolls around, we'll go, oh yeah, remember May 1st when so-and-so did this. I think you're exactly right.
And there's some of the breadcrumb type, stuff that you're looking for too, especially with guys that have been talked a lot about this spring. Like Oliver Martin's a good example. Guys and coaches and his teammates were really complimentary early in spring about Oliver Martin. You're like, whoa, 40-inch Frost said the first day of spring ball, 40-inch vertical, best on the team. He's a great athlete. Wyatt Lever said he couldn't remember him losing a one-on-one all spring. And then you go out there and watch him in an open practice, and he's running by guys, and he looks the part. And so you just sort of like are stacking on that too, right? I mean, that's sort of how the running back narrative came to be what it's been so far this spring. It's like, a couple guys were out that 30 minutes of open practice that we saw. Then the step injury gets reported. Then most of those guys, or a different set of those guys, but most of them are out again during the open practice. And so you're sort of just building, and you want to be careful not to make, declarative statements when you just see 30 minutes one day, one practice a couple weeks later, and a spring game a couple weeks later. But there's also it's obviously a lot smaller than the coaches have, but you have this sort of body of evidence that builds too. So it's just sort of the next step in that. If Omar Manning goes out there and makes a bunch of contested catches again on Saturday, like he did in the open practice, you sort of start to you have one more day worth of evidence to say this must be sort of what it's like most of the time with him. And if a guy who you thought looked really good doesn't show it on Saturday during the spring game, and kind of well, I wonder what happened there. If it was just an off day, or maybe we saw something out of the norm before that, so you just sort of it's what you know and what you don't know. If a guy who I noticed is in Sipple's guide to the defense, which is going up on the Journal Star's website, it's probably already up. Like Blaze Gunnarsson. There's a guy who he was a freshman last year at a position that's hard to play at a young age, outside linebacker, and he dealt with injury stuff. There's a guy where if he flashes on Saturday, you're I wonder what a healthy summer will do for that guy going into the fall. So you just sort of it's like you say, Sipple, you're not going to take any big sweeping conclusions out about the program maybe, but you do, it's another sort of interesting data set individually.
Yeah. Hey, speaking of that, I might anger some people here.
Do it. This is
I have two questions.
Yeah.
It could anger some people in Nebraska. Where I don't know where UTAN is.
It's northeast here. It's kind of just west of Omaha.
Okay.
West of Omaha?
Yeah, just west. Well, everything's west of Omaha, I guess. But
yeah.
Here, let's pull up the Google Maps. I'm pretty sure it's just west of Omaha.
Northwest.
And why? And here's a question for you guys. Why am I asking about UTAN?
I know why you're asking about UTAN.
Why am I, Baz?
Because you want to talk about Mr. Colton Feast. UTAN is on UTAN is straight west of Omaha on Highway 92. It's between Meade and Omaha.
Good job.
About halfway between Wahoo and Omaha.
Why do I not know where UTAN is? Don't answer.
You've probably never been there.
Yeah. Okay. Now, why do we bring up Colton Feast, Baz?
Because Tony Tuioti brought up Colton Feast yesterday and said he was feasting on the opposing offense. He did not say those words, but it would have been a lot cooler if it would have been awesome if he would have said he's if Tony Tuioti would have gone, yeah, he's feasting on the, and then waited for a laugh, like a dad telling a dad joke, but he didn't do that. No, he said he's just a guy that's taking advantage of his reps. He didn't necessarily have a ton of opportunities, and it's kind of similar to Blaze Gunnarsson. It's he's playing a position that's really hard to play when you're a young guy. It's hard to play when you're an old guy on the defensive line. And he's a guy that was a star at UTAN. Was a dominant at his level, class C2, helped him win a state title.
Okay.
Came to Nebraska. 6'2", 280 on the defensive line, and he's taking advantage of his reps, and maybe hasn't gotten a ton of them compared to some of those other guys, but the reps he's gotten, he's been really good, is what Tuioti said. And the word Tuioti said was trust. He's earned my trust to give him more reps and give him more playing time going forward. And he was brought up unprompted yesterday. Tony Tuioti brought him up unprompted. He was asked about, who might
top
be
six.
Yeah, who would be in his top six, who would be among those guys, and Colton Feast was a guy that he mentioned because of the way he took advantage of his reps. And he said he's got one speed. He goes 100% all the time, which any coach is going to love. So, yeah, you're kind of looking at a guy, maybe kind of like the next Ben Stilley, if you want a comparison, a kid from local school here, smaller school who's taking advantage of his opportunity. And now it looks like he's going to get a chance to run with it this spring and into the fall.
Yeah. Top six. He talked about him. I read the quotes that you supplied us. It sounds like Colton Feast is in the top six defensive linemen. Now, if you look at it, there's probably more like seven. But that's interesting itself,
Yeah, and the word too, Yodi said again, he said I have 6 that I trust. So, and again, he said he trusts Colton Feast. So you have to assume by that he's in that 6 that he's talking about.
What else is on your mind, Parker?
I was just thinking about Feast as one of those guys that's sort of like you wouldn't have, wasn't it? Well, there's always every spring, there's guys that you don't expect to drive the conversation when spring ball starts. And then I think a lot of fans naturally have these questions about like, oh, is this just narrative or is there legs to it? And those conversations are a little bit different. I think it's fair to say that the coaching staff really likes Baron Miles Jr., who you referenced earlier. Now, like, is he going to play 20 snaps a game? Like, probably not, unless they have real injury issues. But he could be a special teams guy. He made the travel roster last year, so again, you sort of like you just kind of putting the pieces together. Similar with Colton Feast, similar with Matt Sichterman at right guard, which that'll be one of the interesting things to watch this weekend is sort of Sichterman and Brant Banks and in the competition for the right guard job, the only job, as we understand it, that's open on the offensive line at this point. And so there's this list of guys, right? Colton Feast, Matt Sichterman, Jaquez Yant. These are sort of like the guys who have really come into focus in terms of guys who we don't know that any of them are going to be starters or major contributors in the fall, but are guys who are on the radar now that maybe weren't 5 weeks ago. And that's sort of, that's one of the things that's useful about spring ball, not only for the coaching staff to give those types of guys their opportunities, and then, the world sort of learns about them as well as spring ball goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot. We could talk all day about this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of interesting. I mean, there's like, I think of a guy like Quentin Newsome, who looks like he's going to lock down. I think you guys would agree. I'd say Newsome has taken a pretty sizable lead for the starting cornerback job opposite Taylor Britt, which is a development. And I've heard and seen enough of Newsome that I am starting to refer to him as a rising star. I like the confidence with which he plays. I like his size. He's 6'2", 180. He kind of has that corner brashness about him. And like I said, I mean, I think he's pulled away from some pretty good corners too. That's definitely a guy to watch, in my opinion.
And with him, he's a guy too that just briefly, Baz, he was one of the only guys in that 19 class that didn't redshirt. He was a guy that Travis Fisher trusted right away. He didn't play a ton on defense, but he did play some at corner in nickel and dime packages as a true freshman in 2019. And then he was on special teams right away. So, and he probably, he might've been more of a factor. He broke his arm or his hand or something last summer. And was limited a little bit until not long before the season. He was playing remember he had a cast, I think, as they got going last year. So he was just slowed a little bit by that. Otherwise, he might have been even more of a factor in that cornerback picture earlier in camp or in the season before last year too.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I was gonna go in a different direction if we're looking for guys that are interesting, and you guys might laugh at this one, but Daniel Cherney, what's he gonna look like?
Yeah,
will he kick? First of all, and we've beaten the horse on special teams for years now, and rightfully so with the disaster that it's been. But what if he goes out there and either A, is bombing everything 70 yards down the field, or B, is shanking everything 25 yards down the field? I think there's a lot to look at there. And we talk about, guys that you watch in the spring, and maybe it's a harbinger for what's coming in the fall. That could be a guy that's in that position, because you don't bring a guy all the way from Australia unless you think he's going to play. You don't put the resources and the time into that unless you think he's going to do it. So I'm kind of interested to watch him just to see what he looks like. He's a big dude. He's like 6'4", 220 or something like that. Like
he's big.
He's a big dude back there, and he's an athlete, So what's he going to look like? And if he goes out there and he has a good day, maybe that gives you a hint that, maybe special teams are moving in the right direction. Obviously, that's a small part of special teams, but maybe that gives you a little bit of comfort as you head into the offseason.
That might be a guy too, though, Baz, that might be a guy where you say, okay, give him a shot. I mean, I can't believe, he's never punted in front of 30,000.
Yeah.
So that might be a guy who's a little, now he's older, he's in his 20s, but he might be a little freaked out by the scene.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a definite. Daniel Cherney is, I mean, you're looking at, they want him to be the starting punter. They scholarship the punter. I mean, you don't put a scholarship on a punter unless you think he's the guy.
Well, and what did we hear, earlier in the spring? Like, he's still basically learning what football is, and we kind of laughed about it a couple of weeks ago, but came out and didn't know offense from defense, didn't know 10 yards for a first down, didn't really understand that he's not supposed to run down the field and try and lay a lick on somebody after he punts it. So, yeah, you mentioned what's he going to think walking out into a stadium that, even though it's half full, it's still going to be like nothing he's ever seen. So, and it's going to be half of what he sees in the fall, basically. So, yeah, I think it's kind of a sneaky, interesting part of this whole thing, I think, is that how he looks, how the special teams just look overall.
Pete?
Yeah, I'm with you. 20 to 30 mile an hour winds out of the southwest tomorrow, or on Saturday. So
they're gonna have Daniel Cherney punting one direction on Saturday.
Yep. He's gonna be bombing 70-yarders with the wind at his back.
Cherney kicked another one into the stands. He's incredible.
What else? We covered the injuries. We're looking. We didn't talk much about number 2. I think that will look good to people, but he's been here for 7 years, so everybody knows that.
Well, that's still interesting, right? Like, he kind of needs to look good, like
he does.
He can't really afford to not look good. And you mentioned it, the way he looked a couple of years ago, Sip, and from all accounts, he's been great. He's been here forever and had a strong finish to the year last year, but don't go out and throw 4 interceptions on Saturday.
With no pass rush.
With no pass rush, or like fumble it in a thud drill, like just drop the ball when you're running down the field.
Please no.
Oh, that's what I'm like. Don't do that stuff.
Right.
Just go out and play clean and be solid, and you hope it's as uneventful as possible for Adrian Martinez. You want boring out of Adrian Martinez, and you take that into the offseason.
Boring and 80% would look pretty good.
Boring and 80% with like 4 or 5 or 6 touchdowns in a show drill, basically.
I guess the last thing maybe about the game itself to touch on is talking about the quarterback of the present. And there's it's possible that a couple of the quarterbacks of the future not only are playing in Smothers and Harburg, but also coming to the game on the recruiting front too. There's a bunch of guys. I think we talked about it some last week, so we don't need to spend too much time on this, but there's at least, we're talking about, I've got 16 guys, I think, confirmed from the 2022 and 2023 class, just among guys that have Nebraska scholarship offers already that are going to be in town, even though it's a totally unofficial deal. They can't be on the field. They can't be hosted by the school. They're just here on their own. But MJ Morris in the 2022 class is a quarterback from Atlanta. And then Reese Mooney from Louisiana is in the 2023 class. Both those guys are going to be in town just on their own dime, on their own volition. MJ Morris, the 2022 class is a unique one because of the pandemic and all that, obviously. But MJ Morris is in sort of an interesting situation. He told me, maybe a few weeks ago, early April or late March, that he wanted to make his decision in May. So that's coming up, obviously, in the next couple of weeks. Florida State was thought to be a pretty serious contender for him, and they just took a second quarterback in their class yesterday. So they're done recruiting quarterbacks for the class. And then NC State's another one to keep an eye on. But it's going to be interesting with MJ Morris. He's going to be on campus this weekend and wants to make a decision in the next few weeks. So that's definitely one to watch for the 22 class. And then Reese Mooney, we've talked about and written about, grew up, a Nebraska fan. His dad grew up a diehard Nebraska fan in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. They live in Louisiana now. Sort of a funny story, how they found him. Mario Verduzco he was down there recruiting another guy, Ty Keys, in last year's class. And of course they ended up taking Harburg, but Ty Key's head coach is friends with Reese Mooney's dad, and apparently told Verduzco, like, hey, there's a young guy, you got to see this. And they watched like whatever 20 or 30 minutes of him, and they were like, yep. So they offered him, and then it turned out that his dad's like a huge Nebraska fan who hasn't missed a game on TV in 26 years. So,
and they're from Louisiana.
They're in Louisiana now. Yeah, Mooney's dad grew up in Mississippi.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Clark, our boss, Clark Grell, the sports editor at the Journal-Star, wrote a story about a little thing about Reese Mooney's dad, Teddy, and his wife. Like, there's this photo. We have this photo of him in the paper outside Memorial Stadium in 2012. And they were actually playing Southern Miss that day, but it was like Teddy Mooney hasn't missed a game in 15 years or whatever it was at that point, and now 9 years later, his kid's the only quarterback in the country that Nebraska is recruiting for the 2023 class. So it's kind of a crazy story on that one.
Yeah, it is. That's really crazy. But recruiting, so people understand, is really going to heat up. I mean, you're going to be busy in May and June. Well, we all are to a certain extent, mainly you guys, because I don't do a whole lot anymore.
I'm going to go ahead and clip that. I don't do a whole lot anymore.
Look at Parker, just straight face. I was joking around. Hey, he's
like pinching his leg right now to keep from laughing. That's what Parker.
There's one other topic that we didn't. Baz mentioned it at the outset. There's two things. Wait a second now. There's two things that I thought yesterday. One, Frost said something pretty interesting. And the media kind of glossed over it in their reports about the quarterback situation. And he didn't say they were going to stick with what they got and not go in the portal, but he almost said that.
Yeah,
and he was pretty close to saying we're not going to the portal for a quarterback.
Yeah,
Parker.
Yeah. I thought it was very interesting. I sent it to you as a note, and then you decided where it went in the notebook pecking order.
All right. Are we passing the buck right now? Is that what's going on?
Wow. I could have told you. I could have instructed you lead the notebook with it. So I did not do that. It was interesting though, and it would be. I thought just the way that Frost talked about the young quarterbacks yesterday, sort of saying like they're not all that. It's coming. They've made progress, both of them. It's obviously they got a long way to go, but. He was talking about Smothers, and he's like, yeah, I mean, the mechanical thing, it's not all the way there yet, but I trust that it's going to be by the fall. I mean, that's a pretty big vote of confidence from the head coach. And then to say, we've got 2 spots left. We haven't decided how we're going to use them, but right now I wouldn't think that quarterback would be at the top of the priority list. I mean, another pretty big vote of confidence. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. I mean, the rubber's going to meet the road here in 3 days or whatever. It's spring ball's ending around the country. There's another wave of guys going into the portal. And so it won't be long before we sort of start to get an idea of who Nebraska is looking at in the transfer market. Now it's been pretty quiet. They've managed that they're sort of portal recruiting. I mean, Samari Toure is the only guy I can really think of who we sniffed out fully before they committed. I mean, a couple years ago with like Kanawai Noah, like that just came out of nowhere. It's like, oh, they got a receiver from Cal, I guess.
Yeah, like one July day, right?
Yeah. It's like
just out of nowhere.
Right. Yeah. So that it's a little different. Those guys, a lot of times, like they're not as vocal about offers and stuff because they've been through the recruiting process once, and once is enough for a lot of people. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see. They're going to have to make some decisions, and it's possible. I mean, like you said, Sipple, we don't quite know what the deal with Will Honus is at this point. Obviously, we know Fedoni's going to be out until mid-season at the earliest. Those two are positions where Nebraska's depth is okay. Or pretty good, but you just don't know exactly what they might be thinking about where they need help. And then the full health picture coming out of Saturday will play a role in that too. I mean, they've been confident about Marquis Stepp coming back this summer, but feet are tricky. If there's doubt about that, or you'll know quickly if they really feel that way or not. Because if they offer a running back in the portal, you're going to say, oh, well.
Yeah, which leads me to the other thing I wanted to bring up. And this can be the last thing, but I talked to a couple people in the program about this, what Frost said yesterday, and it's not a real comfortable topic over there. That Frost mentioned they had 43 guys at one time or another on the injury list this spring. 43. Now that doesn't mean there are 43 guys not practicing,
right? But
that was, with some people in the program, they felt a little uneasy about that number. 43.
Well, yeah, it's over 35% of your roster. Yeah,
right. Now that, again, it doesn't mean there are 43 guys standing watching, but they're on the injury report, and you can bet there were 25 watching probably, which is a big number. And the day that we were there, it was a Saturday. What was it? 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. I was a little uncomfortable with how many guys were watching that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen a lot of practices over there in a quarter century, and I can't remember too many where there were that many guys watching. So that's something to think about. It's not anything, I wouldn't make too big a deal of it. I mean, we're an hour into a podcast, but it's just something to think about.
Well, and you've got all summer to heal up, and it looks like fall practices next fall are going to be much less physical per NCAA rule, just with the amount of contact that's going to be even allowed, so that's going to be part of it too. So, it's, go ahead, Sip.
No, you go ahead.
No,
you go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No. Here's the thing. An old guy, I don't like mixed messages. I mean, you'll hear Dawson come out, I just forget I said a name. Any coach come out at the start of spring and say, this is big spring. Every practice is important. Every practice is important for the guys. They're battling for jobs. We're trying to get this thing going. And then at the end of spring, you hear that they had as many as 43 guys watching at times, or 43 guys on the injury report. So I don't know. That's the sort of thing that kind of causes some confusion sometimes, I think. Okay, maybe.
I agree with you. I mean, there's people make of spring. You can make spring anything you want. Like it's a critical time for development. Oh, it's not that big of a deal if a running back misses a couple practices in spring. Like, oh, it's just the spring game, but maybe a quarterback doesn't look good in the spring game. You don't know exactly how to grade everything that happens. Like, it's like I made this point, like people have asked me a lot this spring, how concerned should we be about the running back situation? I don't know. It's hard to say. But part of the reason why that feels different than like Ben Stilley being out is because you know what Ben Stilley is as a player. Like you know what he's going to give you. You know what upside might be left there. He's a solid player. He's not Randy Gregory, but he knows what he's doing. He played his best ball of his career down the stretch. Like he's a known commodity. Whereas in the running back room, you don't know what you have. If it would have been Mohamed Ibrahim that had missed all of spring, the Minnesota running back, you wouldn't worry so much because you know what he is. You know what you're going to get from him when the lights come on in the fall. But part of the thing about some of the guys who have missed time for Nebraska this spring that's concerning is it's guys that are trying to win jobs and don't have them locked up. Like you worry less about JoJo Doman not playing on Saturday than you worry about Marquis Stepp missing essentially all of spring ball when we went into spring ball saying this is probably their guy. Mm-hmm. But you don't know that. So that's where I think you get to the concern level elevates a little bit for those guys that missed a lot of time and they're not the returning 60 or seniors, so it's hard to know exactly what to make of that, but it doesn't help. That's for sure. When you have a lot of guys on the injury.
Bass, baseball.
Speaking of, it's a big weekend, kids, around Lincoln, America. Huskers are back home for 3 games against Rutgers. And you think, it's Rutgers, not a big deal. No, this is a huge series. Rutgers is much, much, much improved. I think I saw the number today. They've won 9 road games this year in the Big Ten. And in all their previous years in the Big Ten combined, they'd won 11. road games. Vastly improved. This is kind of the start of the real portion of Nebraska's schedule when it gets a lot tougher. Especially, you play Rutgers for 3 this weekend. Next weekend, you go to Piscataway, play Rutgers twice more, and play Indiana twice. You still got Ohio State. You still got more games against the Hoosiers. You got that series against Michigan at the end of the year. It's going to start getting real for Nebraska. And they come into this thing ranked. And they come into this thing ranked because they took the series from Michigan State. But that was basically a spectacular play from Jackson Hallmark away from Nebraska being 1-2 on that weekend and not being ranked, and coming into this weekend going, oh my God, what's wrong with Nebraska baseball right now? They didn't play well last weekend. So you're going to see, 6,100 fans are allowed to come in now, about 75% capacity. Beautiful weather forecast, as everybody's been talking about. There's going to be some people there to see what this team's about that haven't seen him in person all year. So this is a chance for Nebraska to kind of recapture momentum a little bit, to get some good feelings before they go back on the road and play Rutgers twice more in Indiana, like I said. And you're doing it against a quality opponent. And Nebraska's at 20-7. I think they probably need to get to 30 wins minimum to feel pretty good about getting an NCAA bid. Forget winning the conference. I think that's the number you look at. Not that they're looking at a number over there, because that's not what they focus on, but they've got some work to do yet. You've played basically the bottom 5 teams in the standings so far. So you have the top half left, essentially, and it's the last month of the season. So this is a big weekend for Nebraska to kind of get it back on track after not playing great last weekend. And it'll be interesting to see with how many people show up and how this team's able to play when they got a big crowd watching them.
Interesting, Baz. Listen to what we're saying. This is a big weekend for Nebraska to get back on track. They're in first place in the Big Ten.
I know, it's funny. Yeah. Well, and like I said, that if they lose that game Sunday, the 12-inning game against Michigan State, it's totally different, right? They're not ranked in the top 25. They're probably not projected to host a regional like they are this week. And you come out of that weekend going, man, Nebraska didn't play very good, and they lost to a team that's not very good. And instead you look at it and go, well, Nebraska didn't play very good, but they found a way to win too. And maybe that means they're a pretty good team. So I think it tells you the fine line Nebraska's walking, even though I think they're pretty good, and they've shown that they're a pretty good team with their record and their play. Man, it's just such a fine line this year when you're playing conference only, when your RPI is just so tenuous week in and week out, when you're playing conference games. Excuse me. And it just, that's what makes these series pressure packed for Nebraska. You just can't show up and play Rutgers and think, we win a couple, we'll be fine. Like, you've got to be you're going to be favored in all 3 of those games. You're going to be favored in all 3 of the games you play against Northwestern in a couple of weeks. These are games you need to win before you get into the real meat of what's left. So yeah, we're saying, well, yeah, they're in first place and this, that, and the other thing, but it's going to be hard to stay there. And it's going to be hard to keep that thing moving in the right direction if you're going out and you're losing a couple to Rutgers and your momentum's kind of stalled here a little bit. So yeah, it's a big weekend for Nebraska, as they all are now coming down the stretch.
One final football thought. You mentioned a fine line with the baseball team. Football's got a fine line too. I mean, Moose is talking about wanting that team to win 8 or 9 games. It's a really fine line with Nebraska. Now think about this as it applies to the quarterback situation. Think about this while you're watching the spring game. It's a fine line with Adrian Martinez as your starting quarterback. What's that line like if he's not your starting quarterback?
Yeah. And here comes Iowa or Wisconsin or whoever it may
be. Exactly. It's a fine line with number 2. So that's just something to think about as you're watching on Saturday.
I got one question for you before we go, Sipple.
Yeah.
When we go over to the groundbreaking for the new facility tomorrow,
yes.
Are you going to get to drive the bulldozer or anything? Like, are they going to?
Do you get to take a ceremonial chunk of sod out of the infield?
Yeah, like, are you going to be able to? Do you get to take a scoop out with the backhoe, or
oh my God, that'd be
incredible. Are you just going to be a spectator on that one?
I
hope they get over there. They've got like a custom paint job on the backhoe with Sipple's name on it.
Yeah, Clark would appreciate that for sure.
Yeah.
I wonder if we will be given hard hats.
That would be cool.
So.
Let's hope so. Let's hope we get to wear a hard hat.
I'd like to
A
wear a yellow.
long time coming on that project, though. A year delay from that was announced. We were over there the Friday before the Ohio State game in September of 2019.
Yeah.
And
Let's go on a weekend. Game day was in town.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a fairly big weekend.
Yeah, the
Then the
Buckeyes
game
were in
started.
town.
And then the game started.
The Buckeyes.
Nebraska,
were in town,
I think,
that's
had a
for sure.
basketball game that weekend too. I can't remember who they played, but they had a big
Really?
game. Or they had their Rick Ross
Rip.
thing that weekend. That's when Rick Ross was
yeah.
in town.
Oh, God.
For the
Third
beginning of
fall.
camp.
Yeah, the beginning of the Fred Hoiberg era. Quite the weekend that turned out to be. And then the game.
Justin
started.
Fields was in town.
Justin Fields was in town, and he was very quickly watching from the sideline after Ohio State went to work in the first half in that game.
Anything else, guys? That was pretty long. That was an hour almost.
No.
It was like 45 minutes.
It might be 2 or 3 minutes longer than what we normally have gone.
Oh, really? I thought it was a little longer.
Well, time
see.
flies when you're having fun, and you're clearly
Yeah.
not having fun.
And I
Yeah,
do
so-
apologize to the people of Utah. I should have known where that is.
We'll take out an apology ad in the UTAN newspaper and make sure that the people are
Good
appeased.
idea. Okay.
All right,
paid for
guys. Enjoy the spring game this weekend. Enjoy the baseball games this weekend. We're starting to get back to normal. The weather's beautiful. We'll have a full recap for you guys next week. Thanks for tuning in.